Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. For those who are new here, my name's Nicki. I'm an author and editor and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading and all the other things I love. Today you've joined me for a Crash Course in the Classics vlog. In this series I'm looking at the works by classic authors, giving you a little bit of information on their history, their major works, themes, how to approach them and adaptations. Today we are looking at Charles Dickens, which is a huge undertaking, but I'm going to do my best to sort of narrow it down and give you the basics. So Charles Dickens is born in Portsmouth in 1812. However, his family moved to Chatham in 1817, where he spends 5 very happy years before they all decamp to London. And he lives in London then pretty much up until 1860. His father is a middle class. He's a clerk in a Navy pay office. However, he's not great with money. Between extravagance and ill thought up ideas, they end up broke, and his father is in debt, in prison for debt. So that happens in 1824, and at this point Charles is pulled out of school and sent to work in a factory, where he has to stay for a little while until his father eventually makes it out of debtor's jail and he's able to resume his studies. So this is interesting for Dickens, and it really does influence his works in a major way. He experiences that drop from middle classes to the working classes. He does return to school, as I said, until age 15, and at that point he becomes a clerk at a solicitor's office before going on to become a reporter, first at law courts and then later on more parliamentary commentary. It's in 1833 that he begins to send some stories and descriptive essays off to magazines and newspapers. These are published, he's received well, and they ask him to pen a serial. And what he comes up with is the Pickwick Papers. As of most of Dickens' works, these are published in serial form, with new sections coming out or new chapters coming out, either weekly or monthly, depending on the book and which publication it was in. At this point he gives up reporting to become a magazine editor and an author, and around the same time he marries Catherine Hogarth. He carries on this serialisation of novels with works such as Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop and Barnaby Rudge. His popularity grows. He's a popular author within his time period. He becomes a major public figure, and he's invited to give after-dinner speeches and various things. Most of his works are actually translated into stage adaptations pretty soon after they come out. So he's being read, he's being watched, he's being talked about all the time. In the mid-1840s, he makes various trips to Italy, France and Switzerland, and yet he's still essentially based in London. He enjoys entertaining at home, has a wide circle of friends, and he also goes on long night walks in the city. Despite his fiction work, he's retained an interest in journalism, and he does try to return to it around this period as well. He eventually manages this more successfully in the 1850s with Household Words and All the Year Round, which he's writing for, helping to edit and produce. And both of these were weekly publications that were sort of little snippets of different bits of news and fiction and all sorts going on in them. Throughout the 1850s, his main work in the novel sense does become darker. We get works like Bleak House, Hard Times, and this is probably linked to the fact that he separates from his wife Catherine in 1858, mostly due to the fact he's developed a fascination for a young actress called Ellen Ternan. It's about this time, during his separation, that he begins giving the public readings for which he became so well known towards the end of his life. And he would travel around reading initially from his Christmas stories, but later also sections from some of his novels. He particularly liked doing, for example, an exchange between Bill Sikes and Nancy from Oliver Twist. His last completed novel is Our Mutual Friend, which was published in the mid-1860s. He did begin another, Edwin Drood, which unfortunately was left unfinished at the time of his death. It was after he was doing an American reading tour that he began to fall ill. He collapsed in 1869 before eventually dying very suddenly in his home in Chatham, Gad's Hill, in 1870. And he is buried in Westminster Abbey. So that's a very brief little overview of Dickens' life. So now let's go on to look at some of his key works, which I will list, as always, at the side here. I mean, Dickens wrote so many works, if I tried to list them all, it would be illegible on your video screen. So I'm just going to pick out one or two. So we have the Pickwick Papers, 1836 to 37. Oliver Twist, 37 to 39. Nicholas Nickleby, 38 to 39. Christmas Carol in 1843. David Copperfield in 49 to 50. Hard Times in 1854, Great Expectations in 1860 to 61, and Our Mutual Friend in 1864 to 65. In terms of the themes, I mean, Dickens is a realist writer, which was popular at the time. There's a certain streak of Victorian sentimentality that runs through some of his works, but for him the main focus is on, he looks at a lot of social issues, he looks a lot at institutions, Victorian era institutions such as the workhouse, for example, in Oliver Twist, debtors' jails and things in books like Little Dorrit. And he also has a wonderful knack for character. You'll find Dickens' characters are always larger than life, and some of the way he achieves this is through characterisation of speech. And often he does these characterisations of speech that work beautifully. In some ways they're almost over the top, and yet they come across so well, both in terms of reading and hearing the dialogue. So I think Dickens, I said in my Thomas Hardy video a short while ago that I kind of consider him and Dickens to be very similar. They both address social issues, but one of them was doing it in the country, and Thomas Hardy, and Dickens was set in the city, and London plays a really important role in many of his novels, as does the sort of Chatham area that he loved, where he did move to for the last decade of his life. In terms of how to approach Dickens, I actually didn't like Dickens so much when I read him in my teens. I was reading a lot of classics at the time, and he wasn't one of my most favourite, although I did read through most of them. However, coming back to him as an adult, I appreciate him a lot more. I think I've got more of an appreciation for his prose style, and also for the issues and the emotions in his writing. If I were you and you hadn't read any Dickens before, I would start with A Christmas Carol, moving on to Great Expectations after that. They're both fairly short works, very accessible. From there you could move on to something like Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, and before you work your way up eventually to works like Bleak House, Hard Times, Barnaby Rudge probably sits in the middle somewhere as well. So, I mean, some of the books are really hefty. I haven't actually got them out next to me today, as I usually do for these videos, simply because there are so many of them and it would make the shelves behind me look bizarrely empty if I took all the Dickens out. But some of them are quite hefty, so I do recommend, if you're new to his work, start with the slightly smaller volumes, the shorter works, and work your way up from there. If you're someone who likes to see adaptations before reading the books, I have a few for you mentioned here. So I've just worked on the list of books I put next to me here. Of course there are others. There's a wonderful TV version of Little Dorrit done only a few years ago, so you might want to check that one out. But going back to these, Pickwick has been put on stage a lot. There's a very famous musical with the song If I Ruled the World. You might know the song even if you don't know the musical. There was also a 1985 mini-series, although this one's not filmed as often as some of the others. Oliver, of course, Oliver Twist has been filmed many times. There's a 1948 film you might want to have a look for. The 1968 film version of the musical, which is definitely worth a watch. And there was a 2007 mini-series you might also want to check out. Nicholas Nickleby, I recommend the 2001 mini-series, which starred James D'Arcy, and I had a brief cameo, I believe, from Tom Hiddleston in a little minor role. I think he popped his head up in a scene or two. A Christmas Carol, there are so many. I mean, I wouldn't even begin to discuss all the Christmas Carol versions there are. There's musicals, there's Scrooged, for instance, the film that puts it in modern times. The Muppets Christmas Carol, so many versions, and depends on what sort of take on it you want, which one you'd look for there. For David Copperfield, there have been quite a few film and TV versions. I might suggest the 1999 two-part TV adaptation, which starred a young Daniel Radcliffe for any Harry Potter fans out there. And Hard Times, there was a 1994 TV version with Richard E. Grant that you might want to have a look at. And finally, Great Expectations. Again, there's been so many film and TV versions of this. There's a musical, I think, floating around somewhere. But I would suggest the 2011 TV version, or the 1999 film, or the 2012 film. So that's a very, very brief introduction to Dickens. Have you read his works? If so, do you have a favourite? Pop it in the comments below. If you've got any questions, add those down below too, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And I'll be back again very soon with another vlog. Bye for now, everyone.